Professor Lily Kong is the fifth president of the Singapore Management University and Lee Kong Chian Chair Professor of Social Sciences. She was formerly provost at SMU, and before joining SMU, she was a faculty member at the National University of Singapore's Department of Geography for nearly 25 years. She also held various senior management roles at the National University of Singapore, including Vice Provost of Education, Vice Provost of Academic Personnel, Vice President, University and Global Relations, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Dean of the University Scholars Program, and Director of the Asia Research Institute. Professor Kong is widely known for her research on urban transformations and social and cultural change in Asia. In particular, she has published a large body of work on religion, cultural policy and creative economy, urban heritage and conservation, and national identity. She is on a dozen editorial boards of international journals in her field and is frequently invited as keynote speaker to conferences in her domain. Her keynote today is entitled Sustaining Cultural Heritage, Developing Strategies for Youth Involvement. So without further ado, let me hand over time to Professor Lily Kong to deliver her keynote address. Professor Kong, please.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and thank you for the kind invitation to present this keynote address. As you heard, I intend to speak squarely to the theme of the conference and have entitled my talk, Sustaining Cultural Heritage, Developing Strategies for Youth Involvement. This is something close to my heart, being an educator and dealing on a daily basis with the education of young people. I realize that the second day of the symposium focuses on technology, and I apologize that I will only be touching on that very briefly and only then in passing, so please bear with me. I will begin by sketching the interconnectedness of tangible and intangible cultural heritage, which explains why I focus my talk on sustaining cultural heritage more broadly and not on intangible cultural heritage exclusively. I will then proceed to highlight the importance of youth involvement in cultural heritage if that heritage is to gather meaning at all for the future. And finally, I will outline 4 to 5 strategies for youth involvement, as many as time allows. These ideas draw from an understanding of human needs, and to the extent that these strategies help to respond to human needs, they stand a chance of ensuring that a society will be able to witness the longevity of its cultural heritage. So first, the interconnectedness of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Tangible cultural heritage is visible, material, and therefore, for most, real. It makes sense to look at physical artifacts, at monuments and sites, and talk about maintaining them for future generations. The physicality of artifacts, the materiality of built environments, and the tangibility of products of human creativity render them in some way real and therefore visible. It is unsurprising, therefore, that they are able to capture attention and interest amongst those interested in and invested in preserving, conserving, maintaining, and transmitting such heritage intergenerationally in society. They are arguably easier to interest young people too, given that young people can be invited to visit heritage sites, walk the corridors that past generations traversed. They can produce replica artifacts and therefore be involved in the making and remaking of heritage as such. Now let's turn to intangible cultural heritage, which might refer to the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, and skills that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. Now, what I've just read to you is famously and influentially the UNESCO definition of intangible cultural heritage. Examples of intangible heritage are oral traditions, performing arts, local knowledge, and traditional skills. These, in contrast to tangible cultural heritage, are arguably more difficult to grasp than tangible cultural heritage. They're less visible and perhaps less accessible. However, I do note that they can be rendered visible through the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces that are associated with them. So we talk about hawker culture as an intangible cultural heritage in Singapore, and the cultural space associated with that would be the hawker center itself. So in that sense, the tangible and the intangible intersect in real ways. The UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, conceived and subsequently ratified in 2003, highlights the interdependence between intangible cultural heritage and tangible cultural and natural heritage, thus implying that the preservation of the latter, meaning tangible cultural heritage, can contribute to the preservation of the former. However, preserving the latter only would not be sufficient to preserve the former. UNESCO thus spearheaded the recognition and promotion of living human treasures, by which they mean persons who possess to a very high degree the knowledge and skills required for performing or recreating specific elements of the intangible cultural heritage. So the very fact that they were recognizing and promoting living human treasures foregrounds the value of people in the expression and transmission of intangible cultural heritage. Now, while intangible cultural heritage finds a material basis in the associated instruments, objects, artifacts, and spaces, it should be noted too that tangible cultural heritage is similarly intertwined with the intangible. So sites and monuments, objects and artifacts draw meaning not only from their materiality, but from the ethical values, beliefs, myths, and social customs associated with them. These form part of the intangibility of tangible cultural heritage. Clearly, therefore, the interconnectedness of tangible and intangible cultural heritages render their separation more apparent than real. It is a reminder to us of the need to think holistically and in connected ways about their management and their transmission. So enough said about the interconnectedness between the two, which I suspect many of you in the audience would be familiar with, but I lay that groundwork to allow me to turn now to the second part of my address, which is to emphasize the absolute necessity of youth involvement in sustaining cultural heritages. Young people play a crucial role in the safeguarding of heritage of all kinds. The reasons are obvious. If a society is invested in preserving, conserving, maintaining, and transmitting such heritage for future generations, that intergenerationality means nothing if today's intergenerational transfer, if I might put it that way, breaks down. If the younger generation today finds little meaning in such heritage, one might say that the entire raison d'etre of safeguarding it is lost. If today's youth are not interested and do not see such practices, traditions, arts, and skills as part of their inheritance, the game is over. Further, why will they even consider passing the heritage on if they do not value that heritage now? Intergenerational transfer will simply not take place beyond this generation. It is therefore critical to involve young people in sustaining cultural heritage if that heritage is to have longevity. So I turn now to the third part of my address today, which is to ask what strategies might be useful in involving and interesting young people in cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. As I mentioned earlier, I'll outline 4 or 5 strategies if time allows. I think I've got about 10 minutes, so I should be able to share a few. Now, all the strategies that I'd like to share are anchored in ensuring that cultural heritage is relevant to young people and responds to their personal needs. I emphasize relevance and personal needs. These strategies draw inspiration from none other than Abraham Maslow, the Russian-American psychologist whose notion of hierarchy of needs has become embedded in the popular imagination. Now, Maslow's ideas were anchored in human development psychology and therefore framed in terms of stages of development or stages of attainment, each stage to precede the next. And while in contemporary thinking, this notion of hierarchy and stage precedence has been decentered, and instead overlapping and reversionary needs are now recognized, depending on culture and circumstance, I would nevertheless say that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or at least his notion of the different types of needs, is still a useful concept. I adopt the more decentered approach in my remarks below. The more decentered approach meaning that I don't necessarily think of stage precedence. So first stage achieved before the second stage can be achieved, before the third stage can be achieved. I recognize the overlapping nature of needs. I recognize that some needs may take precedence because of circumstance and culture, and those needs may not have been the basic needs that Maslow talked about. So let me just clear my throat with all of that and say that I will just kind of focus on some of the various needs that Maslow talks about. Before I get to that, I will very quickly note that there are also other criticisms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but now's not the time to go into that. Suffice to say that I think there is a certain level of intuitiveness that makes some of the needs that Maslow identified difficult to dispute. So let me therefore proceed to use them to frame my remarks on possible strategies to ensure the relevance of cultural heritage to young people, and therefore to have them invested in sustaining and maintaining such heritage for future generations. Another caveat, I would also like to qualify that these needs are not unique to young people, and therefore the strategies are not applicable only to them, though the relative emphases may differ for people across ages. So, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, what that hierarchy addresses is what he calls two types of needs, deficiency needs and growth needs. Deficiency needs are physiological, safety, love, social belonging, esteem, right? Growth needs, on the other hand, are cognitive, aesthetic, self-actualization, and transcendence. Now, I use them only as starting points to suggest strategies that could be devised to address the needs of human individuals, the various needs of human individuals. And in those strategies, they use cultural heritage as medium. In so doing, cultural heritage becomes directly relevant to the lives of young people. I won't have time to address all the deficiency and all the growth needs, so I'm just going to pick a couple from each to illustrate my point. Now, first, Maslow talks about safety needs. What does he mean? By safety, he means a range of human needs, perhaps conceptualized around physical needs, physical safety, economic safety, and emotional safety. Physical safety for him includes safety from war and violence, for example. Economic safety includes job security, financial security, and emotional security includes, for example, safety from abuse. Now, what has all this got to do with cultural heritage, you may ask? I would suggest that strategies for youth appreciation of and involvement in cultural heritage should address some of these dimensions of safety for them to be relevant to young people. For example, the use of heritage, such as childhood rhymes and stories, in emotional therapy can address the emotional safety needs of young people. Now, mental health issues, mental wellness is a major issue, certainly in Singapore at this point in time, but more generally, certainly given COVID lockdowns and issues like that. And so how do we ensure that the emotional safety needs of individuals are recognized? Now, using heritage in that, using arts and other kinds of cultural heritages as ways of developing emotional therapy techniques can address emotional safety needs and therefore be relevant to young people. In this way, heritage is weaved into the warp and woof of life and not sequestered as a sort of activity that you go to, a place that you visit, a museum site that you chance upon, and so forth. It is actually a part of one's life. Another example of safety needs that can be addressed through heritage would be in the area of opportunities and for jobs and careers. These opportunities tied up with the heritage industry can address job and financial security needs. And so once again, heritage can be weaved into the warp and woof of life and not sequestered in a separate compartment unrelated to everyday living. It follows, therefore, that creating jobs in the heritage industry, offering opportunities for youth employment, and developing arts therapy methodologies that incorporate performing arts and traditional skills are some ways in which young people can encounter, find relevance in, and benefit from heritage, such that it is a living heritage. Now, second, let me turn to another need that Maslow talked about, and here he was talking about social belonging as a very important human need. This refers to interpersonal needs in which a sense of belonging to a social group matters and contributes to a sense of well-being. Young people, in particular, have a need to feel they belong, and being part of a group can counter a sense of isolation and loneliness. And we know that teenagers very often feel that sense of isolation, of loneliness, of a search for identity and belonging and so forth. It's not confined to young people, but perhaps particularly marked in young people. Social belonging develops in myriad ways organically, but can also be cultivated and nurtured. Clubs at schools, associations in the neighborhood, and other organizations around common interests and causes can provide a focal point in the lives of young people. They can build a common identity and hence a sense of belonging. Such clubs and associations and organizations can center on heritage activities, attracting those with interest and deepening their engagement, but also draw in those with less initial interest in the subject matter, but more interested in being part of an in-group. So this is to say that sometimes it is heritage that draws people to groups, social groups, and by being part of the social group, it enhances their social belonging and sense of identity and therefore well-being, serves a particular need. That's one kind of engagement. But the other kind of engagement, as I've intimated, is that actually sometimes young people are not necessarily interested in the subject matter itself, but are interested and feel the need to belong to a group and willy-nilly become part of a group. And then when others in the group are interested in a subject, they carry along these other people. So what this is to say is that heritage can very much contribute to the well-being and respond to the social belonging and emotional needs of young people. Now, let me just turn quickly to a third interesting need that Maslow identifies, and this is the need for esteem, a need for respect from others, for recognition, and even status, fame, prestige. This is a phenomenon that we can recognize in our own quiet moments. I recognize it in myself as a young person many years ago. I became much more interested and much more invested in something which I do well in and I'm recognized for. So when I ask students today why they have chosen for further study a particular subject, often it's not surprising to hear a response like, I did well in it, right? So you were recognized, you were rewarded for it, and you were praised and so forth. And then you feel much more encouraged to pursue it. That's a very fundamental esteem need, as Maslow puts it. Thus, building scaffolds of recognition and reward can further nascent interests and deepen involvement. Awards to young people for participating in the documentation of heritage, awards and recognition for creative application of traditional skills, for effort and skills and preservation and so forth, all this recognition and reward can go a long way to further encourage involvement. And very often for young people, there's nothing like a school competition to get you going. And the award, the prize at the end of the day is further encouragement to get involved in these activities. And basically what that does in human development psychology terms is it responds to the esteem needs of individuals for recognition and so forth. Now let me turn to a fourth need that Maslow talks about. And this is where I'm moving away from what he had categorized as deficiency needs. So things like, safety needs and esteem needs and social belonging needs. Now I'm moving into the second category of what he called growth needs. And growth needs, he identified as cognitive needs, aesthetic needs, and so forth. So I'm just going to have time for maybe one or two of them, and that's what I will do. Cognitive needs are reflected in curiosity, the desire for deliberation, for discussion and brainstorming, which schools and educational institutions are, of course, very well placed to address. Activities that raise awareness, that encourage dialogue and debate, that demand research and exploration will appeal to those whose cognitive needs are very strong. And building heritage themes into these activities can constitute a part of the strategies for developing interest in young people. These cognitive strategies need not be confined to subjects like history or social studies only. In fact, cultural heritage matters can be embedded in teaching and learning across school subjects from mathematics to design to music and even physics. And these are all very powerful ways of nurturing future heritage workers, heritage enthusiasts, and heritage supporters. And here, as I emphasized, it's about appealing to the cognitive needs. And somebody who is very interested in debate, is a part of the debating team, may not originally have an interest in heritage, but is asked to debate a motion on heritage, will do the research, will do the study, will engage in dialogue, and therefore learn about heritage and hopefully develop that interest. So cognitive needs and therefore cognitive strategies follow in terms of building interest amongst young people. Fifth, and I think I will let this be the last strategy that I'll talk about. Maslow talks about aesthetic needs. That is the desire for aesthetically pleasing experiences. Aesthetics is a tricky concept. It's a culturally inflected experience. It can be influenced very much by medium. And generally, young people may be assumed to have a preference for popular cultural media over traditional media. So how can we harness that popular cultural media that they're familiar with, that they are comfortable with, to influence the involvement of young people? How do we use, for example, music videos, animation, video games, and other types of interactive media that young people are familiar with? And how can we use these media to capture cultural heritage content to produce aesthetically pleasing cultural experiences that appeal to a cultural cohort, a younger cohort, I mean. And this is as close as I get to technology for today's session, and with apologies, but I'm sure the speakers that follow will have a whole lot more experience and expertise to share about technology. Now, let me close now with a brief summary and conclusion with respect to my other speakers so that I don't eat into your time too much. In these short 20 minutes, I hope to have provided a commonsensical foundation for approaching the question of how to interest and involve young people in sustaining cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. I have chosen not to tease apart these two types of cultural heritages because I believe that both are interconnected and find root and expression in the other. I have sought to show that developing strategies for youth involvement might begin by asking what needs youths have and thinking of strategies that address their needs, embedding their cultural heritage in that process. Thus, if cultural heritage is embedded in addressing the various needs of young people, the safety needs, the belonging needs, the esteem, cognitive, aesthetic needs, and so forth, then that cultural heritage becomes relevant to a young person's life. And the challenge of interest and longevity does not arise. As an educator, I am partial to embedding cultural heritage in education, in formal lessons across a range of disciplines, and in co-curricular activities. But I'm also a believer in informal education beyond formal educational institutions, through neighborhood activities, through those of other social, cultural, and economic organizations. Heritage then becomes living heritage, relevant to everyday lives because they connect with everyday needs. Thank you very much.